The wind howled across the empty plains that night, carrying the chill of a storm that had yet to break. Inside a small cabin, a single lantern flickered on the wooden table, its glow casting long shadows across the walls. Mary sat near the fire, rocking her baby to sleep. The world outside was quiet, too quiet for comfort. The silence of the frontier could feel like a friend one moment and a warning the next. She had learned to listen to it. Then came the sound, soft, uncertain at first. A knock on the door. 3 slow, uneven thuds. Her heart jumped. Out here, no one came after dark unless something was wrong. She froze, her hand gripping the chair, listening again. The knock came once more, louder this time, followed by a low voice calling out, "Please help." Her first thought was of danger. The war between settlers and the Apache had left the land soaked in mistrust. Every man and woman out here had a story of fear. Her husband's grave out back was one of them. She stood, torn between instinct and compassion. The voice outside came again, weaker now, trembling. "The baby needs milk." That was when she heard it, a faint, broken cry. A baby's cry, soft and thin but real. Her breath caught in her chest. She moved toward the door, every step echoing louder than the last. Her mind screamed to stay back, but something deeper pushed her forward. Slowly, she lifted the latch. The door creaked open, and there he was, a tall Apache warrior, his face gaunt, eyes hollow from exhaustion. He looked more ghost than man. In his arms, wrapped in rough animal skin, was a tiny baby, barely clinging to life. The child's lips were pale, its cries fading into silence. The man's voice cracked as he whispered, "Please, milk." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The wind pushed against the door, scattering dust across the floor. Mary looked at the warrior, then at the baby. Something in her heart stirred, a memory of nights when her own child had cried for warmth. Her fear began to crumble. Without a word, she stepped aside, opening the door wider. The man hesitated, then bowed his head and stepped in, carrying his last hope into the light of her fire. The warmth of the fire hit his face as he stepped inside, and for the first time that night, he stopped shaking. The man stood tall, but exhaustion had stripped away his strength. His clothes were torn, his skin streaked with dust and dried blood. He looked around the small cabin, just one room with a bed, a table, and a cradle near the fire. His eyes fell on the baby sleeping there for a heartbeat before turning back to Mary. He looked like a man ready to collapse. She shut the door behind him, locking out the storm. For a moment they only stared at each other, 2 strangers caught in a fragile silence. The baby in his arms whimpered, breaking it. That sound, the weak, hungry cry, cut through the air sharper than any weapon. Mary's breath trembled as she took a cautious step forward. The man shifted his grip, protective but pleading. "He is hungry," he said, the words heavy with struggle. His English was rough but clear enough to understand. Mary nodded slowly. "Sit," she whispered, pointing toward the fire. He hesitated, unsure if he was allowed, then lowered himself to the floor beside it, cradling the child closer. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from fatigue and the cold. The woman's heart raced. Every story she'd ever heard of raids and killings thundered in her mind. But this was no warrior come to fight. His eyes held no hate, no threat, only desperation. The boy in his arms stirred again, his tiny fingers twitching in the dim light. Mary swallowed hard and said softly, "How long?" The man looked up, struggling to find the words. 3, maybe 4 sons, he said. "No milk, no mother." He looked down at the baby again, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "She died." His voice cracked, he said no more. Mary felt her throat tighten. She looked at the child and saw how small he was, how thin. The baby's breath came shallow, each one weaker than the last. Her own baby stirred in the cradle behind her, safe and full, wrapped in soft blankets. The contrast hit her like a wave of guilt and instinct. A mother knows the sound of hunger, no matter the language or skin. Without another word, she took the boy gently from his arms. He stiffened at first, his body tense like a cornered animal, but then he saw her expression, not fear, not pity, but something else, something pure. He let go. She sat by the fire, unbuttoning her blouse just enough, and drew the child close. The moment was quiet except for the crackle of the fire and the wind outside. The baby whimpered once more, then began to nurse weakly. The man stared, disbelief flickering in his eyes. He looked like he wanted to speak, but couldn't. His breath caught, his hands falling limp at his sides. Mary didn't look up. Her focus stayed on the child, on the rhythm of his breathing, on the color slowly returning to his cheeks. The firelight danced across her face, catching the tears that had begun to form there. She told herself she would never let her heart open again, not after losing her husband to a senseless war. But here she was, feeding the child of a man she was supposed to fear. Minutes passed. The warrior's shoulders slumped, his head bowing as if the weight of years had finally fallen on him. The exhaustion he'd been holding back took him. Mary watched as his body relaxed, his chin lowering to his chest, his eyes fluttering closed. He didn't sleep out of comfort but surrender, the kind that comes when you have nothing left to give. For the first time that night, she noticed how young he was, not much older than her husband had been when he died. Beneath the dirt and paint, his face was human, worn by pain but not cruelty. She wondered how long he'd been riding, what he'd seen, what he'd lost. The baby finished feeding and fell asleep in her arms, his breathing slow and steady now. Mary wrapped him in a soft cloth and set him gently beside the fire. She glanced back at the warrior, still sitting where he was, his head bowed. He was asleep now, one hand resting near the child as if to guard him even in dreams. She stood quietly, unsure what to do. Part of her wanted to wake him, to tell him to leave before the neighbors noticed a stranger near her cabin. But another part, the stronger one, bring herself to disturb him. He looked too peaceful, too broken. Hours passed and the night grew colder. Mary moved between her two cradles, the one near the fire and the one by her bed. Her baby slept soundly, his cheeks rosy with warmth. The Apache child, though thinner, now breathed deeply, his tiny chest rising and falling with life. She felt something stir inside her that she hadn't felt since her husband's death. Hope, maybe. Or just the simple ache of doing something right in a world that had forgotten what that meant. When the warrior woke, dawn was breaking through the cracks in the shutters. The fire had burned low, and the cabin glowed faintly in the gray light. He blinked, confused for a moment, then saw the child still sleeping peacefully beside him. His hand trembled as he reached out, brushing the baby's small hand with his finger. Mary watched from across the room. He turned to her, eyes full of gratitude, though he didn't speak. He didn't need to. She handed him a bowl of water and a piece of bread. He accepted both with a nod, eating slowly, each bite seeming like a gift he didn't think he deserved. When he finished, he tried to stand, but his legs gave out for a moment. She stepped forward, steadying him without a word. He looked at her again, his gaze deep but gentle. "You saved him," he said quietly. She shook her head. "No," she whispered, glancing toward the baby. "I just did what any mother would do." He looked down, as if the weight of that truth hit him harder than anything else. He picked up the sleeping child, wrapping him carefully. Before he left, he reached into the pouch at his side and pulled out something small, a carved pendant shaped like an eagle. He held it out to her. "You are strong like her," he said softly. Mary hesitated before taking it. "You should keep this," she said. He shook his head. "It is yours now." The wind outside had quieted. As he stepped out into the new light, he turned once, meeting her eyes again. There was something in that look that would stay with her forever, something between respect and sorrow, something beyond words. The door closed behind him, and the cabin fell silent once more. The baby's soft breathing was the only sound left, mixing with the slow, steady beat of her heart. The next morning came slowly, painted in soft gray and gold. The air outside the cabin was still, heavy with the kind of silence that follows after something sacred has passed. Mary stood by the small window, watching as the light crept across the frozen ground. The world looked calm again, almost like nothing had happened, but she knew better. Inside her, something had shifted. The faint sound of her baby waking pulled her back to the moment. She turned, her hands instinctively gentle as she lifted her child from the cradle. He was warm, safe, and full of life. But as she held him close, her eyes fell on the small cradle by the fire, the one where the Apache child had slept the night before. It was empty now. The warrior was gone. Her heart sank in a way she didn't expect. She hadn't realized how much she'd grown attached to that fragile sound, the little cries, the steady breathing through the night. The place by the fire felt colder now. The man must have left before dawn, quiet as a shadow, taking the child with him. She couldn't even hear the sound of hooves outside. Still, he had left something behind. On the table near the door sat the carved eagle pendant he'd given her, glowing softly in the morning light. She picked it up, running her thumb over the smooth edges. The craftsmanship was fine, careful. It wasn't just a trinket, it meant something. A promise, maybe, or a farewell. Mary slipped it into her pocket and went about her chores. She tried to focus on the usual rhythm, feeding the animals, fetching water, mending the firewood pile. But her thoughts kept drifting back to the man's face, to the quiet desperation in his eyes, and the way his voice had trembled when he said, "You saved him." As the day passed, a strange unease settled over her. The wind had shifted, carrying with it a distant sound, low, rhythmic, like thunder rolling far away. It came and went, fading into the hills. Her chest tightened. She'd lived long enough on the frontier to know that sound wasn't thunder. It was hooves. By afternoon, she couldn't ignore it anymore. The noise was growing closer, stronger, heavier. The ground itself began to hum beneath her feet. She stepped outside, shielding her eyes against the glare of the sun. At first there was nothing but the endless stretch of land. Then she saw it, a dark line moving across the horizon. Her breath caught. Riders, dozens of them, maybe more. The line thickened as it came closer, shapes forming out of the dust, men on horseback, feathers catching the sunlight, weapons glinting in their hands. Her pulse raced as she backed toward the door. It wasn't just a few riders. It was an army. She rushed inside and grabbed her baby, pressing him against her chest. The thunder of hooves grew louder until it felt like the earth itself was trembling. Her heart pounded in time with the rhythm. She glanced around, her eyes darting toward the rifle hanging above the door. Her hands shook as she reached for it, though she knew deep down it wouldn't matter. No one could stand against that many. Then just as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. Silence fell again, thick and heavy. Mary swallowed hard and stepped toward the window. Her breath fogged the glass as she peered out. The plains outside her cabin were covered in horsemen, hundreds of them. They stretched as far as she could see, their faces solemn, their bodies still. Every single one sat straight and tall, eyes fixed on her cabin. The air was filled with dust, sunlight cutting through it like gold. Mary froze. Her knees went weak. For a long moment, no one moved. Then one man rode forward. He was older than the warrior she'd met, his hair streaked with silver and braided down his back. His chest was marked with paint and scars, his eyes steady and sharp. He rode slowly, each hoofstep deliberate until he stopped a few yards from her fence. He raised one hand, palm open, in a gesture of peace. Mary stood motionless, clutching her baby tight. She didn't know what to do, what to say. Her voice was gone. The elder dismounted, his movements calm, unhurried. Behind him, the rest of the warriors waited in complete silence, their presence vast and unmoving like the land itself. He took a few steps forward and spoke in a deep, steady tone. The words weren't English, but they carried a rhythm that felt respectful, ceremonial. Mary didn't understand them, yet she felt the meaning. Gratitude. Honor. Then from the crowd, another figure appeared, smaller, familiar. The same warrior from the night before. He was no longer weak and weary. He rode with strength now, the child in his arms wrapped in soft cloth, sleeping peacefully. He dismounted beside the elder and looked up at Mary. Their eyes met. He said nothing at first. He just stood there holding the baby she had saved. The other warriors bowed their heads. Then he stepped forward, stopping at the edge of her fence. Mary slowly opened the door and stepped outside. The wind caught her hair and the cold air filled her lungs. Every step she took felt heavier than the last. When she reached the fence, the the warrior spoke softly. "He lives because of you." His voice carried easily in the stillness. "You gave him life when the world had taken everything from us." Mary couldn't speak. The sight before her was overwhelming. Hundreds of men who had come not with weapons drawn but with heads bowed. The weight of it pressed against her chest, and her eyes filled with tears. The elder raised his hand again, and a group of riders moved forward. They laid bundles near her fence, pelts, baskets, and small wooden carvings, each placed carefully like offerings. The warrior stepped closer and handed her something new. It was another carving, shaped like a mother holding a child. The detail was delicate, carved with reverence. He looked at her for a long moment before saying, "You are the mother of more than one child now." The words hit her like a wave, simple but powerful. Mary nodded, tears streaming down her face. She reached out, touching the carving gently, as though afraid it might disappear. The warrior stepped back and mounted his horse again. The elder gave a final nod of respect, then turned his horse toward the horizon. One by one, the riders followed, moving in perfect formation, their horses kicking up golden dust that shimmered in the sunlight. Mary stood there long after they were gone, the wind tugging softly at her dress, her baby quiet in her arms. The plains were empty again, but the silence no longer felt lonely. It felt alive, like something sacred had passed through and left its mark forever. The sun had barely lifted above the horizon when Mary stepped outside again. The land was still carrying traces of what had happened the day before. The dust hadn't settled yet, and the air still held the faint echo of hoofbeats, like a memory too heavy to leave. She stood at the edge of her porch, her eyes tracing the faint tracks that stretched toward the open plains. Hundreds of hoofprints pressed into the earth, proof that it hadn't been a dream. The morning wind swept gently through the grass, and for a moment everything was quiet. Too quiet. Her baby stirred in her arms, a soft sound that brought her back from her thoughts. She pressed her lips to his forehead, the warmth of him grounding her. The other child, the Apache baby, had gone with his father, but she still felt as if a piece of her heart had gone with him. It was a strange ache, one she couldn't quite name. She told herself it was just the shock wearing off, that it would fade in time. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't. Some things leave marks that never fade. She glanced toward the fence where the gift still rested. The pelts, the carved figures, the baskets, they were beautiful, but they didn't feel like offerings. They felt like reminders. Every time the wind shifted, they rustled softly, almost as if whispering to her. Gratitude, remembrance, connection. It was all tangled together in ways she didn't have words for. As the day grew brighter, she went about her chores, but the rhythm felt different now. Her hands moved the same way they always had, but her thoughts drifted back to the faces she had seen. The calm eyes of the elder, the gratitude in the warrior's expression, and the way the others had stood so still, silent yet strong. There had been no anger in them, no threat. Only a kind of deep respect that humbled her more than she wanted to admit. By midday, the sun hung high and the air shimmered with heat. She went down to the small creek behind the cabin, the same place she fetched water from every morning. The water was clear, reflecting the bright sky above, and as she filled her bucket, something caught her eye. A single white feather floated downstream, spinning slowly in the current. She reached out and caught it before it drifted away. The edges were clean, unbroken, perfect. She turned it in her hand, and for a moment she could almost see the warrior again, the way he'd stood by her fence, the way he'd bowed his head before riding off. She tucked the feather into her apron pocket and stood there for a long time, listening to the water. Everything around her felt alive in a way it hadn't before. The rustle of the grass, the buzz of insects, even the far-off cry of a hawk, it all felt connected, as if the world was breathing in harmony. It made her chest tighten, but not from fear. From something gentler, something she couldn't quite explain. When she returned to the cabin, the light had changed. The late afternoon sun spilled through the window, bathing the room in gold. Her eyes fell on the small wooden carving the warrior had given her, the mother holding a child. She picked it up carefully, running her fingers over the smooth surface. Every line, every curve was made with care. The expression on the carved woman's face was soft, serene, full of love. She wondered if the warrior had carved it himself or if it was something passed down through his people. Either way, it carried meaning and she could feel it. The baby began to cry softly and she rocked him gently, her voice low and soothing. As she hummed, her thoughts wandered back to that night. The knock on the door, the trembling voice, the sight of a man she'd been taught to fear holding his dying child. Everything she'd believed about who was enemy and who was not had shattered in a single heartbeat. The memory was sharp but beautiful in its own way, like light through broken glass. Later, as the sky turned orange and the long shadows stretched across the land, Mary lit a small fire outside. She sat on the ground beside it, her baby in her arms, the carved figure resting on her lap. The air was cool now, the heat of the day fading. The smoke curled upward, drifting lazily into the twilight. Somewhere far off, she thought she heard a faint rhythm again, the same distant drumming she'd heard before. But this time it wasn't frightening. It sounded peaceful, almost like a heartbeat carried on the wind. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over her. In her mind she saw the faces again, the boy, his father, the elder, and felt the weight of what they'd left her with. Not just gifts, but something deeper, understanding. She'd spent years building walls around herself, protecting her heart from loss and pain. But that night when she'd opened her door to a stranger, those walls had cracked, and something pure had flowed through. The fire popped softly, snapping her back to the present. The baby in her arms yawned and nestled closer, his tiny hand gripping the fabric of her dress. She smiled faintly, brushing a curl of hair from his forehead. The world outside her small circle of light was vast and wild, but right now, it felt safe. It felt shared. She lifted her gaze to the sky. Stars had begun to appear, faint pinpricks of light scattered across the deepening blue. They seemed brighter tonight, clearer somehow. She thought of the warrior again and wondered where he was now. Was he looking at the same sky? Was he sitting by his own fire, holding his son, thinking of her the same way she was thinking of them? She hoped he was. She hoped they had found peace. When the fire burned down to glowing embers, she stood and carried her baby inside. The room smelled faintly of smoke and warmth. She placed the carving back on the mantel beside the eagle pendant and the feather she'd found at the creek. The three small objects sat together, glowing softly in the firelight. They looked like pieces of a story told without words, a story about fear turned into trust, about loss turned into grace. Mary stood there for a while, her baby asleep against her shoulder, listening to the quiet hum of the night. The land outside was dark now, but it no longer felt empty. It felt alive, full of echoes that would never fade. Somewhere out there, the Apache warrior and his child were part of that same night, part of the same earth. And in some quiet, unspoken way, they were family now. The days drifted by slowly, and with each sunrise, the world around Mary seemed softer somehow. The sharp edges of fear that had once ruled her life began to fade. The prairie was still wild, still unpredictable, but it no longer felt cruel. When she stepped outside in the morning, she didn't just see land to be worked and survived. She saw beauty again. The way the light spilled across the open fields, the sound of the wind brushing through the tall grass, the colors of dawn, gentle and full of promise. It was as if something inside her had been mended quietly without her noticing. She spent her days tending to her chores, as always, feeding the animals, collecting water, mending the fence, and caring for her baby. But even her baby seemed calmer now, as though he could feel the peace that had settled over their small home. Sometimes, when the afternoon sun poured through the window, she'd sit by the fire and rock him, her eyes resting on the wooden carving that sat on the mantel. The mother and child, the symbol of two worlds meeting, not in anger but in mercy. Every time her gaze met that carving, she thought of the warrior and his son. She wondered if the boy had grown stronger, if his laughter now filled their camp, if his father ever thought about the stranger who had fed his child. She imagined them sitting under the wide western sky, the boy sleeping soundly, the man looking toward the horizon, maybe in her direction, maybe not, but with peace in his heart. Life in the settlement carried on. Word had spread quietly about what had happened, carried by travelers and whispered through town. People talked about the line of Apache riders who had come to her land but left without violence. Some called it a miracle. Others said she was foolish to have let them near her home. Mary ignored all of it. She didn't need anyone's approval or understanding. The truth was simple. She had done what her heart told her to do. One chilly afternoon, a letter arrived. The postman handed it to her with hesitation, his brows furrowed in curiosity. She rarely got mail. She turned it over in her hands, surprised to see no name, no seal, just a simple piece of folded paper. When she opened it, a single feather slipped out, white, soft, and familiar. Inside, in rough, uncertain handwriting, were a few words. "He lives, strong and happy. The land remembers your kindness." Her breath caught in her throat. The writing wasn't perfect, but she recognized the intent behind every letter. It had to be him, the warrior. She pressed the feather to her heart, her eyes stinging with tears. For a long while she stood there in the doorway, the cold wind brushing her face, feeling something she hadn't felt in years, gratitude. That night she couldn't sleep. The wind howled softly outside and the moonlight spilled through the cracks in the window. She sat by the fire, the letter in her hand, the feather resting beside her. She could almost hear his voice in the words, quiet and steady, just like it had been that night. He had kept his promise. The child had lived. In the weeks that followed, she began to notice things she hadn't before. Tracks near the stream that didn't belong to any of her animals. A small bundle of herbs left by her gate, carefully wrapped, as though placed there with purpose. Once when she stepped outside at dawn, she thought she saw movement at the tree line, a figure on horseback, watching quietly. She blinked and he was gone. But the feeling lingered, not fear, but something else. Something protective. The winter months came hard that year, but she didn't face them the way she used to. The loneliness that had once wrapped around her like a cloak didn't feel so heavy now. She had her child, her small home, and the knowledge that out there, beyond the horizon, a bond still lived. One formed not by blood, but by mercy. Sometimes she'd stand outside at night, wrapped in her shawl, looking up at the stars. The same stars that shone above her also watched over them. The same wind that brushed against her hair carried through the mountains and valleys to their camp. She liked to think that maybe, in some way, they were connected by the land itself. The soil beneath their feet, the sky above their heads, the memories they shared. One evening, as she sat by the fire, her baby now asleep beside her, she heard a faint knock on the door. It wasn't the hard, desperate sound she remembered from before. This one was soft, careful. She froze, heart racing, the old instinct flickering alive for just a moment. Then she stood, crossed the room, and opened the door. Outside stood a young girl, no more than 10, wrapped in a thick blanket. Her skin was dark and her hair braided neatly down her back. In her hands she held a small clay pot, steam rising from its top. The girl said nothing, just smiled shyly and offered it forward. Mary accepted it, confused. The girl pointed toward the hills, then placed her hand over her heart before turning and running back into the darkness. Mary carried the pot inside. When she lifted the lid, the rich smell of stew filled the air, meat, herbs, and something sweet she couldn't quite name. A gift. She set it on the table and smiled faintly. Somehow she knew who it was from. She ate a little that night, then placed the rest in a jar by the window. The warmth of the meal stayed with her long after. It wasn't about the food itself, but the meaning behind it. Somewhere out there, they hadn't forgotten her, just as she could never forget them. In the mornings when she fed her baby, she often caught herself humming songs she didn't remember learning, soft, low melodies that seemed to come from the earth itself. Maybe they were echoes of the past few months. Maybe they were something the wind had carried to her. Either way, the music made the cabin feel less empty. As spring approached, the snow melted and the land came alive again. Flowers bloomed along the creek and the birds returned, filling the air with their songs. The world looked new, renewed the same way she felt inside. She'd started that winter as a lonely widow on the edge of survival, but now she felt something greater binding her to this place, to these memories, and to the people she once feared. Every evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of fire and gold, she'd step outside, holding her child close and whisper softly into the wind, "Thank you." It was never loud, never meant for anyone to hear, but she had a feeling that somewhere beyond those hills, the message always found its way home. Spring turned to summer, and the prairie came alive again. The wind no longer carried the sharp sting of winter. Now it brought the soft rustle of tall grass and the hum of distant life. Wildflowers dotted the land in yellow and violet, bending gently beneath the warm sun. The world felt peaceful, open, forgiving. Mary had seen many seasons come and go, but this one felt different. The air carried a calm that she couldn't quite explain, as if the land itself remembered what had passed and chose to rest. Every morning she rose early, just as the light crept over the horizon. She'd step out onto the porch with her baby in her arms, greeting the quiet day. The earth smelled fresh, the sky painted with streaks of pink and gold. Her child was growing fast, stronger every day, his laughter now filling the cabin where once there had only been silence. When he smiled, she saw a reflection of hope she thought she'd lost. The carving still sat on the mantel, right where she'd left it, the figure of a mother holding a child, carved by hands that had known loss and love alike. The feather lay beside it, white and delicate, barely dulled with time. Some evenings, when the light hit them just right, they glowed as though lit from within. They weren't just keepsakes anymore. They were reminders of something sacred, something larger than her small world. Life moved forward in quiet rhythm. The town, miles away, still whispered about her story. Some called her brave. Others said she was foolish for showing mercy to an Apache. But none of that mattered to her now. She had learned that truth was not made of words, but of choices. Her choice had brought a child back to life, had turned fear into peace. That was enough. One afternoon, as she worked near the barn, she heard the faint sound of hooves again. It was distant at first, like a memory carried on the wind. She froze, her breath catching. Her eyes scanned the open plain, and there, emerging from the heat and dust, came a single rider. Not an army, not a threat, just one. The sun shimmered around him, and for a moment he looked like part of the horizon itself. She wiped her hands on her apron and waited as he drew closer. The horse slowed as it reached the fence, and when the rider dismounted, she recognized him instantly. The same man who had once come to her door in the dead of night, a dying child in his arms. Time had changed him. His hair was longer now, streaked faintly with gray, his shoulders broader. But the calm strength in his eyes was the same. For a few seconds neither spoke. The wind filled the space between them. Then he smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth lifting just enough to soften his face. "You remember me," he said quietly. His voice carried the same deep steadiness she remembered. Mary nodded, her throat too tight to speak. He stepped closer, leading his horse by the reins. "My son," he began, his voice catching slightly. "He is strong now. Fast. Brave." He paused, looking toward the horizon. "He hunts with his uncles. He laughs again." Mary smiled, her chest warming at his words. "I'm glad," she said softly. The man reached into the pouch at his side and pulled something out, a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He held it out to her with both hands. "He made this," he said. She unfolded the fabric slowly. Inside was another carving, this one of two children standing side by side beneath a rising sun. The craftsmanship was different now, rougher in some places, but full of heart. She traced the edges with her fingers, smiling through the tears forming in her eyes. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "He said it was for the woman who gave his mother's milk," the man added, his tone softening. "He said you are part of his story." Mary looked up at him, words caught somewhere between her heart and her lips. "He's part of mine too," she said finally. The warrior nodded. For a long moment the two just stood there, the silence between them carrying more meaning than any words could. The wind stirred gently, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers and dust. He looked around at her land, the fence, the fields, the little cabin with smoke curling from its chimney, and smiled. "This place," he said, "is strong like you." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "No, just stubborn." He chuckled too, a deep, warm sound that carried across the field. "Sometimes," he said, "that is the same thing." He stepped back toward his horse and placed his hand over his chest in the same gesture of respect he had shown before. Mary returned it, mirroring his movement. For a moment, it felt like the years between that desperate night and this quiet day had folded in on themselves, leaving only understanding behind. Before he mounted, he looked back once more. "When the wind comes from the south," he said, "and you smell smoke from far away, it is us. We remember." Mary nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "And when I see the sun rise," she said, "I'll remember you." He smiled once more, then turned and rode off, his figure growing smaller until it was swallowed by the horizon. She stood there long after he was gone, her hand still resting over her heart. The land stretched wide and endless before her, bathed in gold. As the days passed, the summer deepened. The grass grew tall, the nights grew warm, and the stars seemed brighter than ever. Sometimes, in the quiet hours when the baby slept and the fire burned low, she thought she could hear distant sounds on the wind, the rhythmic beat of drums, faint laughter, the echo of hooves. It felt like a song carried through time, meant only for her. She began teaching her child small words, and when he learned to say "son," she smiled and pointed toward the horizon. "Always look toward that," she told him. "That's where the stories live." Every morning, when the first light touched the plains, she'd open her door and breathe in the day. The air smelled of grass and earth and smoke from faraway fires. The memories of what had happened still lingered in her mind, not as ghosts, but as warmth. Proof that compassion could outlast fear, that kindness could bridge worlds once divided. The carved figures on her mantel caught the morning glow, their shadows stretching long across the cabin walls. The mother and child, the eagle feather, the two children under the rising sun. Together they told a story the wind would carry forever. A story born from fear but built on love, between a woman, a warrior, and a world that had learned to heal.